Hi, Dr. P here to talk about how a game can derive from a small bit of another completed game. These nuts and bolts screencasts will be about the nitty-gritty details of game development taken from my personal experience, which means mostly tabletop experience, though many will apply to video games as well. So what do I mean by a bit? This is different from transferring an entire game system to a new game or situation, which I do on occasion, and which is common in war games where it's the model that counts more than the mechanics. What are you representing and how well do you represent it, not how you represent it. Perhaps it's more common in non-war games than you might think. In fact, I've heard of games that are essentially the same game republished with another title. No, here I'm talking about taking a small piece from one game and making it a major component of another game. For example, I have read this twice, it doesn't mean it's true, but according to the story, the original Apples to Apples prototype was a quite complex game. The publishers took one element out of the game and turned it into the gigantic hit Apples to Apples that we see today. And if you know Apples to Apples, you know what that one element is. It's been used in other games as well. Now, my example, 35 or so years ago, I designed a vaguely Stratego-like space war game called Doomstar. It was recently published on Steam as a PC game. But when the evolution I'm talking about occurred about 7 years ago, it had not yet been published. I was teaching video game design classes in college, and some students volunteered to play test my games after class. They'd like to play Doomstar quite a bit. One of them said, "You should take those black holes from Doomstar and make another game with them." Well, here we have the video game in the upper left and a prototype of the tabletop game in the lower right. And those four black circles in the upper left are the black holes. The spirals in the lower right are the black holes. The black holes are a way to increase the fluidity of movement in the game. There were other ways. I increased the board size relative to the number of pieces. I allowed two fighters to move in one turn and to combine attacks on one opponent. So two heavy fighters could sacrifice themselves to kill a dreadnought. When a ship moves adjacent to a black hole, it may move one further around the black hole. Now, I know astronomically black holes are no different for gravity slingshots than anything else, but it sounded cool. Well, fighters can change direction this way and keep moving, and they can use several black holes to keep changing direction and effectively move all the way across the board with several turns. And this allows for quite complex moves. And that was true even though Doomstar is on squares instead of hexes, which makes it a little harder to understand around. It still works. I have to admit, I tried Doomstar on hexes after it was done, and it worked fine. But all the testing had been done on squares, so I stuck with squares. If there's ever a Doomstar 2, it'll be on hexes. The Descendant game, 30 years later or approximately, I don't know if it was obvious, but I chose a race game because I could see how those black holes would affect the race in interesting ways. I made a game for more than two with no chance element other than uncertainty about other players' intentions. For two, unfortunately, becomes a puzzle likely to promote analysis paralysis. So at first I used a square board for 4 players and a hex board for 3, but there was sufficient confusion about how the black holes worked on the squares that it caused me to settle on hexes only when I finally got myself together and thought, oh, I can play 4 on the hexes. Here is the board, and players are moving from one side to the other. So they're mixing in with the other players as everybody tries to get to the other side. Now that reminds people of Chinese checkers, although I don't think it was consciously in mind when I did the game. So the players have 5 or 6 pieces, starting at one edge of the board, trying to reach the opposite edge. The pieces have different numbers on them, which is their maximum speeds. Black holes are placed near the board center, neutral black holes you might say, and the players also have 2 black holes that they can place instead of moving, and they must place one on their first turn, so that provides a certain amount of variety in the board to begin with. There are 3 ways to bump opposing pieces back to the start, and it works very well. So, what is the lesson? Take a look at your designs. See if there's an element in them that you can build another, quite different game around. Probably a simpler game, but not necessarily. Think about it. I went from a 2-player tactical space war game to a multiplayer high-interaction racing game. Kind of the opposite of a parallel competition because of all the possible captures and blocking. Keep in mind, often until you actively look for a connection or actively look for an idea, it won't present itself. You have to be active, not passive. Don't rely on "it just came to me" to provide you with your ideas. That is inefficient. Thanks for listening.